Well,
Okay. Um, well, we're going to have an interesting chat, as I always do with these wonderful composers that I meet and instrumentalists. It's just a treat for me. Uh, this particular interview is with American composer Gustav Hoyer. We're going to talk about your 2024 Navona Records release, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. And the CD is very conveniently in two versions, the version for orchestra and narrator, of course, and then another version for orchestra alone as an orchestral suite, or however you want to use it. The Budapest Film Orchestra has made this recording exactly correct. You and I spoke a little bit earlier about film orchestras. They know how to sit down and do this stuff. The narrator, Kent Stevens, is glorious. Every word crystal clear. He's clearly he must be English, but it's a very gentle English accent, and he pronounces words just exactly right when they are supposed to be presented exactly right. Something like depressed instead of depressed. I mean, it was another word, but the idea that he didn't use that a lot, or let alone the poetry, Kent Stevens knows the period, and we're talking. The poetry is by Samuel Taylor Coleridge, 1772 to 1834. The poem was written around 1797, 98, I think. I see it as 1798. We'll talk about that when we get into it a little bit about what was going on in the world of Samuel Taylor Coleridge in that moment that he wrote this incredible rhyme of the ancient mariner. Let's see, what else? We're gonna, as soon as we got all that done, I think what I'll do is we better introduce you. What I have here is a whole bunch of quotes that you have put into your program notes, and Parma has very beautifully put up on the page for this CD. But let's make sure that everybody knows who you are. Born in Denver, everybody pay attention. Even though his first name is Gustav, I'm sure there's a story there. Studied music theory and piano, violin. Pursued collegiate degrees in compositions, written music for a wide variety of ensembles. And it says here media and film and such settings. And yeah, that's right. This is really a mastery of that technique that we'll talk about, that technique of orchestral cinematic music. Very communicative. And that's not easy. Okay. Let's see. You are associate director of the Loveland Opera Theater. Where's that? Is that in Colorado? Oh, Loveland.
Colorado.
Yeah, of course. Okay. You mean kind of a mixed bag, a little light opera, a little musical theater, maybe? How does that little company work?
Yeah, basically that mix.
Yeah, good.
Yep. So it generally in opera in English of various kinds,
Excellent.
so designed to be more approachable.
Yeah, I support it completely. And then let's see, and then of course you put out 2 or 3 records, CDs as well, of your music and so on. So all of that ties, that little bio of you ties into what I heard today. And again, as probably most everybody knows, the day of the interview is the day I devote entirely to whomever I'm going to be chatting with. And so, I kind of go in cold turkey at whatever 10 in the morning with my tea, and off I go. And it's just always this excitement because everything is so fresh, and that's part of my reason for asking you. I saw Rime of the Ancient Mariner. I said I got to know what this is all about, and so on. I think we've done as much of that kind of stuff. Have anything else to tell us about recent achievements of great merit?
Well, it's others to decide the merit, but some things I'm particularly excited about is I composed a symphony recently, and I'll be recording it with the Royal Scottish National Orchestra later this month, and that's a real honor for me to have both to have created a work of that scale and then have it performed by an ensemble of that reputation. So I'm quite excited and continue to create new music in varying forms. But this is something, the Rime of the Ancient Mariner is a big milestone as well. I'm really pleased to share it with the world.
Okay. And this kind of makes me wheel back up. You know that I'm, charting around through my notes here, but it makes me kind of want to move back up a little bit, up to a few things that you have said that'll kind of give us a reference to where you're coming from as a composer. As a classically trained composer, you say, I fell into the trap of thinking that the dots and squiggles I put on a page were music. It took me a decade to move beyond a preoccupation with theoretical novelty and on to truly understand that the notation is merely instruction. And what I'm trying to say is it's easy to drift into, I'm going to get in trouble, academia, in the sense that the art of composition, especially if you are a composer, and as you have said, a classically trained composer is all about, where shall I have the next fugue, and how is the counterpoint working, and do I have any parallel fifths, stuff like that. So, bam, that hit me right away when I read that quote from you, because you are anything, you have gotten over that for sure. Because again, let me just describe this piece, and then we'll get into the details about it as I described it to you. This Rime of the Ancient Mariner, especially in its orchestra and narrator version, of course, is so cinematic. And I use that word a lot, and this is not an insult. This is like an exact understanding of how to grab an audience, especially in this going on in the middle of the 21st century. Masterfully, it's not easy. It's a masterwork to create, how shall I say, to create a moving narrative of imagery, sound imagery, that matches the spoken word. We've heard that a million times, but that ain't easy. And also in this case, I believe you are identifying a very specific, possibly, in my mind, audience. This is a family audience piece. The music is gorgeous, unceasingly gorgeous.
Thank you.
The all of the cinematic emotional needs are met. In other words, it's quite deliberate. In many ways, you are matching very carefully the words to a sound effect, and it's a cinematic sort of thing. So the audience really can be prepared for it all. You prepare the audience very well for these things. It's just a beautiful, beautiful piece, and I see kids loving it because the story is terrifying and has a happy ending. After all, Coleridge Taylor, was the son of a minister. There was something to look forward to after all. But it's just a beauty. I think that's where I hope part of your imagination is going, because I think it's, as we've discussed, it's one of those works about a half an hour long for narrator and orchestra that tells a story that will have kids riveted, will have moms and dads happy to have their kids experiencing this orchestral experience, and will have a score that is utterly accessible to the audience. And that is all a huge compliment to everybody, if you know what I mean? Okay, so
Thank you.
let's just do a couple basics. Because this is a monumental half-hour piece of music based on this poem of the Rime of the Ancient Mariner. So what? When did it happen? Were you in high school? Were you called what?
So my inspiration for the work, I'll start with that and then talk about how the piece that you heard came to be. I was in college, probably about the age Coleridge was when he wrote the poem himself. I would have been a comparable age. I encountered it in college, not having read it prior. I was immediately gripped from a compositional standpoint, how cinematic the text itself is.
Yes.
And for those who are not familiar with the poem, it draws on the romantic movement in literature and art that was happening at that time. And there was a preoccupation with the fantastical, the transcendent, the sublime, events that were epic in scale. And so the poem brings to life through verse a harrowing and an incredibly dramatic journey. And from the very opening lines where the mariner talks initially about being at sea, nautical themes to me are inherently musical because there is a meta relationship of the waves of water. Well, that's what sound is. It's waves in the air. There is a motion and a vigor that is in a nautical tale, and one that is a high adventure implies a drive. So the music, I read the poem and immediately thought, this, if nothing else, it's a series of tableaux of very powerful orchestral textures that will bring to life behind these words the transcendent and the epic scale of what's going on. And again, for those who have a chance to read the poem, it's a little confusing at first. It's a very long poem, and for people unfamiliar with poetry, it can be difficult to enter. And so my other thought was music will provide a gateway for people to more quickly absorb this really wonderful poetic work. It is rich and it endures in English because it is so worthy. And all I bring to it is the third dimension, really taking it from the domain of words and ideas. And part of the power of cinematic music, as you've described it, Dan, and anyone who's encountered a film scene where the music has been taken out and it's just sound effects and dialogue, how flat and two-dimensional it is. When you add music, it has this strange magnetic capability to draw the heart in behind the mind. And so my thought was this music is the beating heart behind the text. And you hear then that does tableau. So how did I come to write it? I had moved to LA around mid 2000s, 2006, and in fact that's when I started to engage different forms of media, film, and other things. I'd been mostly focused on concert music prior to that, and I wanted to challenge myself to create this work I'd always wanted to do, and basically wrote the work with the narration. I recorded myself reading the narration and said, okay, now if I had that, in a sense, it's as if you'd score a film. You have all the dialogue and you have all the cuts, and then the musicians and the music comes after, and it gets tailored to fit like a suit. I said, well, I'm going to write my music having put the narration down, and I'm going to let the music then represent all of the supernatural wonder around this lonely mariner who's narrating the story. So as he relates his story, the world around him that he's conveying is coming to life through the music. And so the piece, I actually wrote the first draft of the entire work you hear in about 2 weeks. So I
Oh,
moved pretty
wow.
quickly.
So it was a
And
beauty of an inspiration.
it was. And as I've often with my music, I tend to write music in a single thread, forward to backward, because to me, part of the compositional journey, it's like an essay where you set down ideas that you then expound, and there's a whole journey of musical reasoning that's lying underneath this. And so you hear motives that appear early in the poem and they're transforming throughout the piece. So there's the mariner's tune, there's the tune of being lost hopelessly at sea, there's the tune of the albatross, and things start to layer on as the dialogue of the mariner alone with this supernatural world that's essentially wreaking retribution and ultimately penance and repentance upon his life. That's all this dialogue that's going. So but the work you asked more specifically when it was written. It was written in the mid aughts, as they say, 2006.
That's lovely, the mid aughts. Well,
Yeah.
you described the actually the process very well, and I think we chatted a little bit earlier, or frankly, I saw it just recently at an old theater I used to conduct in Seattle, grand old movie house. You know, the mighty Wurlitzer came up, and the interview was with the organist, and it's this process of this. We'll get back to because you basically answered one of my earlier questions, but is the whole process. There's the silent movie, and the organist has to just simply, more or less, always improvise the moods that are being presented on film, and you have done that. The moods of the narrative. Of course, it's everybody who composes for orchestra and voice. You know, that's what it's all about: voice or narrator. Uh, but as I said, I think this is just a very specifically perfect target for an audience. This piece. I hope it gets performed more, and we'll pass that on when we put the interview up at performingartsreview.net. And the reason is because it just makes so much sense. And as you said, it's a long poem. But the piece, and you also mentioned or indicated, the piece, ebbs and flows like the great seas themselves, let alone the whirlpools and all the other amazing mystical stuff that goes on. Uh, Still, the sound is you're always very conscious of imagery, sound to the imagery of the words, and the poem flies by. Possibly, in fact, mainly because of your narrator. It just moves. It's crystal clear. And again, we're talking about late 18th, early 19th century style of poesy, very, very kind of almost flowery in the these and the thous and so on and so forth, but very, very clear text. And again, what a story that we know others must have read later, like Edgar Allan Poe and so on, because it's a great, I don't know what it is. I guess it's a ghost story sorts, or is it 3 or 4 stories in one?
Yeah, it's an interesting question when you read it. It is a maritime adventure, which would have been popular, and we talked a little bit about some as European exploration had started to unfold.
Exactly.
There was
That's
this,
why the public was so interested at the time in all
and
of this.
whaling had become a big industry in New England, and so we know later that becomes Moby Dick. But the whole reality of oceanic travel and transcontinental travel over the sea led to all of these stories of sailors and the wonders and the mysteries of a globe that had been largely undiscovered prior to then. And then these adventures happening. And you marry that with, again, the Byron, Goethe, the Romantic authors had, and even later in the US, you have Emerson and the Transcendentalists started to infuse the natural world with a sense of it being a mirror of spiritual or metaphysical realities. And so the idea that the story is an allegory too of, and almost directly a story of sin, penance, repentance,
Uh-huh.
and
Yeah, yeah,
and
yeah.
and transformation. So it has a very rich allegorical meaning, and some people view it as, does it exalt people who, he slays this beast, the albatross in the middle, and kills it thoughtlessly, and people who are passionate about the environment seeing that is a crime, and there is this sense of you've wronged the natural world, and there's a retribution and a consequence, and so it has resonance there. It also, Coleridge was raised in a Christian context, and he was Catholic in his faith. He would have had meanings that are associated with that. So it's many layered poem. It survives because of its depth. And then I just had the privilege to bring the music. I do want to talk about Kent Stevens briefly, just a little,
Sure.
because you've noted his
Please.
recitation.
Excuse
He
my runny
was,
nose here. Pardon.
yeah, no problem. He was a performing opera baritone. So the
Ah,
richness of his voice and his sense of musical timing is
yeah,
exquisite.
exactly.
And
The pacing of his voice. Exactly. That explains a
he
lot. I had no idea.
he knows, and when I performed it live, I had an actor who had a wonderful breadth of expressive emotion, because the poem has different characters
Sure.
voicing
Yeah,
different
yes.
parts,
Yes.
and that worked well. But the problem is this person can't read music, and so as I conducted it, it was a live performance. There was a lot of difficulty of syncing what needed to be said at the right moment to match the musical events. It was difficult to do with limited rehearsal. So when we went into studio, the orchestra had already been recorded, and Kent was able to exactly dial in the pacing, the tone, and the way I described it to him is as if it's a concerto for narrator and orchestra, because you will speak and you're the lead, you're the soloist, but when you drop out, the orchestra picks up at that moment. And so it isn't just a background wallpaper, it's really a dialogue, a continuous dialogue between the narrator and the orchestra, which I think you noted. And Kent just was musically intuitive, and his speaking is excellent, and his elocution was clear. I was just thrilled.
Yeah.
He's fantastic.
It's magnificent. And we're also talking about period literature.
Mm-hmm.
The recitation of period literature ain't easy. We know that from Shakespeare. You know,
Yeah. Yeah.
so bravo, or is it bravi, tutti to the orchestra
Mm-hmm.
for, and again, European musicians, sit down and play. And this was so interesting. I've heard, and that's a great recording area. Parma has
Mm-hmm.
zeroed in on that part of the world,
Mm-hmm.
and found all these wonderful orchestras. But the Budapest Film Orchestra, wow, they just play beautifully. Let's see what else. How do you want to go about looking at this? Oh, there was something else um, about this about contrast, but it'll come up later or not. Doesn't matter. What I wanted to ask is, for example, are there any difference you have on the CD, as we mentioned, the piece with narrator and then the orchestral piece itself? And I listened to it, but I wasn't kind of paying attention because I kind of took that for granted that it was the orchestral without narration.
Mm-hmm.
Is that score, the orchestral score alone, a little different in any way since you are aiming at it? Okay, I was just wondering.
Not at all. In fact, the only difference would be there's one moment in the narrated version where the narrator speaks over silence, but with the orchestra only, that silence would have been too extended. So we just
Oh, I
truncated
see.
that silence. But other than
I see.
that, and my intent, as we discussed, of having the two versions side by side was to first allow the poem its featuring with the orchestral backing, but then without the narration, listeners who are interested in the work and enjoy it can now take the spoken word, which serves almost inappropriately in the foreground. It takes that away, and the layers of depth in the orchestration, you can now enter into that differently. And you'll hear details when you're not contesting with parsing language being spoken that uses different parts of the brain. You now can listen to the music and you'll hear the textures. It's a fairly deeply textured work. There's a lot of layers in the compositional and the orchestration decisions. That becomes visible or perceivable when the spoken word's taken away. So I hope people can encounter both works and draw value from first the narrated version and then enter into the or instrumental only, and particularly, Dan, for those people for whom the orchestra and long form orchestra, like tone poems, can be a little bit hard to understand, a little unfamiliar, hard to follow. My intent is they have a lattice work with the poem they can now take into the purely instrumental version and enjoy the orchestra for its own beauty directly.
And as we also mentioned, it's a great educational tool in preparing the piece, no matter what. In other words, if you are lucky enough to have a narrator, then you, a conductor or whoever's preparing the orchestra, can have that opportunity to hear just the orchestral score and sort out, as you said, it's a very rich and thick orchestration. And you know what I mean? You do a lot of stuff. You're a master at this. Is what I think I've been babbling for about
Thank
the
you.
past half hour. And so everything is in place so perfectly in the timing and all the rest. And we talked or started to talk before I lost my mind earlier tonight for the second or third time. But that idea of subtext and meaning, and this is the beauty also of that period in terms of literature, as we kind of mentioned Moby Dick. I mean, it is all of that literature from that period is loaded with subtext and allegory and messages and biblical texts and all the rest, and the reading public of the time knew it all. You know, the
Yeah.
literate audience of the time got it all. I think, really, although Moby Dick was not successful. Go figure. Anyway.
Yeah.
Now, the reason I'm maybe a little befuddled is I'm not quite sure how to move ahead, and I'm thinking, why don't I? You tell me if you think this makes any sense. But I'm looking through my stream of consciousness, famous notes that I do, while I'm listening, and I thought, as I mentioned to you, I did it kind of track by track rather than section. There are 7 sections in the poem. And I thought maybe if I just throw, because I pull some quotes, and that might maybe give you a little context into which you can bring us, if that makes any sense. So let me see if I can find them. Well, first of all, this part of the text, I love the intonation of the speaker, but also the intention of the words bright-eyed mariner. It has so much meaning because it could be bright eyes of insanity for all we know. You know what I mean? The story is so macabre and so bizarre. But this bright-eyed mariner who nevertheless scares people to death, his skinny hand and all the rest. At length an albatross. And on that quote, what I have notes here is wonderful underscore to this narration. I'd call it very successful musical imagery. The albatross is slain, a bad omen or portent, and the music is there to fit what's coming in the next track. You want to have what? You want to say anything about that, or how do you want to see what I mean? I'm a little stumped on how we should go through the sections.
Well, I can talk about some of the phrases that you mentioned and talk about the connection, first of all, musically. When I went through this, the opening scenes, it is the Ancient Mariner, and he stoppeth one of 3. And this idea of the bright-eyed mariner is our wedding guest, who we meet shortly in those first series of stanzas, is just going about his life. And something arrests his attention from just day-to-day life, as we would be going to the store or just moving about our business. And it's this bright-eyed mariner. He is distinctively hypnotic. And what we find out in that moment is that wedding guest has an appointment that he didn't know he had with this mariner. That bright eye seizes this person because you hear that the wedding guest has no choice but to sit down and hear the tale. He is appointed to hear that story. And so the prologue of the music is the roiling of the ocean, and it sets the tone and the mood and the atmosphere. And then you sit down and it moves much more into a simpler, lighter texture of once upon a time. We're going to listen to a story about an ancient mariner, but it's actually about the wedding guest. The poem's about the wedding guest, and the Ancient Mariner is telling that story not just to the wedding guest, but to the reader and the listener. So we are the wedding guest when we sit down on the stone. And so that's a super powerful moment. And then you mentioned the albatross. The albatross is the representation of purity, of goodness, of blessing. And in the poem, when the albatross is slain, that's the act of sin. That's the act of fall from grace that the mariner has voluntarily chosen. In fact, you realize in the poem, there was no reason to do it. It was simply
yes,
an act
exactly.
of thoughtless
It's made
wickedness,
very
really,
clear.
nothing else.
It's made very clear.
And that albatross needs to shine unstained and innocent. And so you hear the rising line of the oboe, and I've liked the oboe as a texture, a lot of it because it has this melancholy. Even when it's bright, it has this kind of dark melancholy to it that it carries, and it can be very searching. And so that idea of the albatross's theme portends it portends the sorrow of the albatross's death. But the albatross, ultimately, that slaying of that albatross that launches all of the supernatural chaos that follows later in the poem, that albatross theme keeps coming back because at the very end, it's it is the epilogue. The albatross hangs over the last notes of the piece. It is the transformation of that journey. And where the transformations happened, it's not with the mariner. We hear about that. It's the wedding guest.
See, now this is like multiple. No wonder I'm losing my mind. I keep losing track because so much stuff is going by. But when you did explain the whole, of course, we all know that this is an innocent, is a sign of good luck. The albatross, and to come to any damage, by humans is a horrible, horrible thing. So we all know that on one level. But I never thought of the text that popped into my head. Worthy is the Lamb. And I think, in a way, I hope I'm not being sacrilegious here, but in a way, you have just described an allegorical symbolism that this albatross has never held for me until this moment. That this is really
A Christ figure. It's
a,
allegorical for a
yeah,
Christ figure.
yeah.
Absolutely.
So
Yeah.
that never occurred to me. Of course, I hadn't even heard about the poem from all my life, but I never read it until the task arrived today. But that's what we find so exciting about literature from that time too. It's so deep and so many sub-basements to it. Wow! And so now I'm going to sneak on because I see here that so now they're done. The albatross has been killed by the mariner. The ship is slipping into a bad time. You feel it right away in the music. A still sea wind, and then there's this whole description about how the albatross is killed. Boom! The wind dies. They're in this deathly stillness that is the end of ships in many ways. And that's where the text "water everywhere, nor any drop to drink" from this poem. Go, yeah.
Yeah, and you hear in that moment. So the idea, what's going on is there is this fascination with global sea travel, and that would be the doldrums. If you read
Thank
what's
you I've been searching for that word. Yeah,
the doldrums,
yeah.
yeah, and that's the case where out in the open ocean, there's pockets where the wind certain times a year won't blow, and a wind-powered ship is basically stranded. And so the idea that a ship in the middle of water is effectively in an area as dry as the Sahara Desert has this own rich poetry to it, and they're stuck dying of thirst in the middle of water. And that's that line, water, water everywhere, nor any drop to drink. All the boards did shrink conveys is a salty water. This is not potable water. It's not the water of life. It's a desert. They're stuck in a desert at sea. And what you hear in the music is down drop the breeze. The breeze dropped down, and the sails stop immediately, and they're just frozen. And musically, you just hear this waiting. They're just waiting on an open ocean and not moving. And the music suddenly stops. And all you have is a slow plucking of a harp. It's the passage of time. They're just waiting. And so musically, the way it draws out that moment, you're right, it turns quickly after the albatross is dead. Things really start going badly for the crew.
And in my notes, the breeze is gone. The music is perfect. Let's see. So the mariner's in trouble, and also the crew's starting to get that they are doomed, and it's his fault. So now I'm into the third track, if you will. I'm not sure which section of the poem we actually and this is that whole scene. I don't think I'll spoil it much. I'll let you explain it. But that whole scene of an approaching,
Vessel.
okay, if you want to call it a vessel, this thing is coming after them. The mariner spies it. There's something coming. A sail, a sail. Okay, take it from there.
Yeah. Well, and help people, the poem is written in parts 7. So Coleridge denoted them, and those are the tracks. So those track boundaries, part 3 of the poem is part 3 of the music. So it's a way to navigate. If you listen to the
track 3
poem,
of the music? Is track 3 of the music?
yeah. So track 3 would be part 3 of the poem. So
The
if you
reason I
read the
was
poem
confused
online,
is because I was under the impression that the piece with narrator ended after track 5. That's where I got kind of
it goes through 7. 7
Oh, it goes
tracks
to,
are with narrator. Yeah.
silly
And
me. Never
so,
mind.
yeah.
Now
And
I feel
so,
at ease. We can talk about the next section instead, because I had it
yeah.
all in here is part 2 or part 3, and then I thought, am I sure? Track 2. So okay, good.
Yeah,
Thanks.
so the
Thanks.
tracks 1 through 7 are parts 1 through 7 of the poem. So if you read the poem, you're like, oh, what happens? Here's part 6. Here's what the text says. How did the music treat? You can go right to track 6. You don't have
So
to listen all the way through.
here is part 3, then
Yeah.
where the mariner spies this, and
The ship.
talk about Flying Dutchman and every other spooky symbolism you want to come in here. He describes the gossamer, this gossamer ghostly image of the sails coming at it. Go ahead. How'd you wrap your brain and your music making around that whole scene? It is a complete scene, really.
It is. Well, and the way the poem unfolds, it's just so brilliantly written that the mariners are at sea in the doldrums, and the first thing they notice is, oh, a ship's coming to save us. We're stuck. And then they start asking the question, how is it moving? There's no wind. How is this boat coming? There's no wind to push it, because if there were wind, of course, they wouldn't be stuck. And then there's this line where it moves twixt the sun, and they see that the sun is flecked with bars. Basically, it's a skeleton ship. It shouldn't even be floating. They realize that's the reveal at the moment, that this is not a natural ship, and it's not coming to help them. It's tacking, coming back and forth and zigzagging toward them, and it is not a natural entity. It's a supernatural encounter. And so as the boat comes, the way the music builds is it starts where the mariner they're constantly looking at the horizon to try and find help, and says, oh, there's a ship there, but he can't speak because he's too slaked with thirst. So he sucks blood out of his own arm just to parch his throat enough to speak. He says, a sail, I see a boat.
How did I miss that?
We're saved.
Anyway.
Yeah, with black lips baked, with black lips slaked, and cried, a sail, a sail.
But the blood sucking part, I'll have to reread.
Yeah, I bit my arm, I sucked the blood, and cried, a sail, is what he says.
And by the way, speaking of filled with symbolism, it's got to be just loaded with symbolism. Okay,
there's a lot of it. Yep. And so he cries out, and then all the other mariners are excited, and you hear the music, and it's very hopeful, like, we're saved. Finally, someone's going to help get us out of where we're stuck and we're dying. We can get relief. And then the music turns as they start to realize, when the boat passes in front of the sun, the music changes and starts to become very dark and ghastly, when they realize, no, this boat's not coming to save us. This is something different.
The naked hulk alongside came.
Yeah.
200 shipmates dropped down dead. Oof.
Yeah. Yeah, and it is a picture of deep penance. It's a purgatory of sorts, because the mariner will be alone among the corpses of his fallen comrades, to whose death it's to him. It was his act that brought this whole thing to pass. And so he sits there swamped with the guilt of his action, as all the mariners who die around him, they always have their eyes open. They die with their eyes open, and they look on the mariner the whole time. So 200 accusing corpses with 400 eyes, 200 pairs of eyes or whatever it is, staring at the mariner constantly, dead. It's a horrible picture of guilt.
Okay, I am going to have
very deep.
Definitely go back and really. I've listened to the piece with narrator 2 or 3 times now. Of course, I've done other things as well after I made my initial notes, but I don't remember the blood-sucking bit, and I don't remember the staring dead eyes. I can't wait to re-experience. After we're done, I'll re-experience this. See what I mean, everybody? About how this piece is just a beauty for presentation, and we'll talk about that later. But let's continue. I can't see anything but videography and special this and descending panels. I see it as a magnificent performance art piece. I don't know what you think about it, but I think it just has a gazillion possibilities. You know what I mean? In this modern age where the modern theaters have all these video techniques capable without distracting in any way whatsoever from the music and the narration. Okay, well,
Yeah,
so now this is where I
that.
get a little lost. How does he, the Mariner? The next thing I have in scene 4, in part 4, is the groom is afraid of this tail. Now I got a little lost about how does the Mariner get ashore and get back? And in other words, is this an in and out hallucination or what? That's how complex it is.
Well, so the large structure of the poem is as follows. We open with the mariner stopping the wedding guest. And so that's why I say the poem is really you, the reader, are the wedding guest when you see the poem, and the mariner stopping you to tell you the story. It's really very meta that way. But as the narrator's relating the story, the narrator is the ancient mariner. He stops his story because he sees the wedding guest when he tells the wedding guest all of these supernatural events he's been through. And then the wedding guest is looking at this ancient mariner talking to him saying, you're dead too. You're one of those dead people. Look at you. You're brown. You're as brown as the sea sand. You're parched. You're mad. You have this bright eye. You're terrifying. Are you one of these dead people you just told me you encountered? The wedding guest is terrified for himself in the presence of this mariner. The mariner says, I didn't die. I'm telling you everyone else died, but I'm not dead. I'm not one of those things I just described. Be calm, thou wedding guest. And he says, no, let me finish my tale. I'm a man like you with a special story. And that's the moment where the wedding guest breaks through the narration. It's like, wait a minute, this just got really weird.
Yeah.
And you're scaring me now, storyteller, because I think you're one of these fallen dead people. And the mariner says, no.
He says, fear not, and continues with the story.
Fear not, thou wedding guest. 'Twas not this body that dropped down. Basically, I didn't die the way these others did.
He along the rest dead. 1,000 slimy things lived on, and so did I. I mean, the flagellations are amazing in a way. He's as you said, doing penance in without doubt. And by the way, the slimy things. This has got to have all kinds of primordial biblical symbolism, and you are quite pleased, I think, with your slimy sounds. What I'm getting at is, it's wonderful. The sound that gives you this impression that the sea is alive with creepy crawlies.
Oily, yeah. It's this kind of oily, dark, and you live near the sea, so there's certain ways that can happen. The ocean has many personalities.
Okay, well, you want to give us the denouement, the moment when the albatross is released from his thing, or from his.
And so he learns when the albatross, it's hung around his neck. There's a totem of his guilt. So this whole time he's in penance, he's carrying the totem of his guilt, and until that can fall away, he can't be redeemed from his penance. And so in his moment, where his crime was to have slain the albatross thoughtlessly and to not value the beauty of what it was a gift of beauty, a natural gift of beauty. In that moment, he looks at all the water snakes, and he's alone on a boat with dead men staring at him constantly, and he cannot die. And he's looking out on the ocean, and what does he find out of that? He finds blessing. He finds beauty. He sees in the water creatures beauty and wonder. And in that moment, he says, and in my heart, I blessed them unaware. He was able to speak goodness to that natural world. And in that moment, his transformation can now begin, because he has learned the humility, and he has now, regarding things that are truly beautiful, he's now freed from his indifference that he had before.
My notes are
now he's been saved.
My notes are, he dreams, it rains, he's been redeemed. Yeah. Anyway, around sweet sound. We were a ghastly crew, around sweet sound. I'm in part 5. The crew are angels, not the risen ghoulish dead, and angels sound that makes the heavens mute. I mean, just the genius of the words alone. No wonder this is such a great masterpiece that we all need to read at some point.
it's worth a read, even if you never hear the music. It endures as a great poem in our language for a reason. It is a masterwork for sure. In that moment, what's going on with the story is the dead men have fallen, and this is after they became animated and they've helped operate the boat, and they fall down dead. You realize it was angels using their corpses. They weren't ghouls. They're not zombies in the way we think about them. The bodies were being used by angelic beings to start to deliver the the mariner from that oceanic prison. Now he's being driven. The boat needs to be manned. One person can't operate a huge vessel like that. And so these people begin to work the ropes. You hear that whole journey, and they're basically corpses animated by celestial beings. Then you hear around that sweet sound as those beings start to leave those bodies.
Is this
and
when
the boat,
when the spell gets snapped? Are we anywhere near that? I see here a note that says the spell snapped. Harp. Soon a wind drifted upon me. Is he entering the homeland now, entering the harbor, or have I skipped ahead too far? Have I messed up the story?
It's not. He's coming into the harbor still, and you hear the whole poem is a poem of penance to a large degree.
Here. Yeah, the conversation is about penance, but you're saying the whole poem is about penance.
And there's two moments where there's these angelic beings, and you hear around their sweet sounds, and you hear, it sounds like birds. And so you hear in the orchestra, you hear the chirping and the tweeting of birds. Those are the angelic beings. But later on, there's two spirits who then are explaining what's going on, because the mariner is now collapsed into almost a coma, and the boat's being basically supernaturally propelled. And the spirits are riding alongside, basically as observers, like, hey, here's the story of this guy on the boat, and they're talking amongst themselves, and the mariner's struck in slumber on this boat that's moving by itself. So the corpses aren't manning the ropes.
I noticed that ascending orchestral bit of imagery in that particular moment, which is really amazing imagery that you throw in there. It's wonderful to go with the words. They stand on the deck, the crew all glaring at the mariner. The spell is snapped. Harp. Something, I think there's the color among the colors. There's this harp color. Soon a wind. I hope I'm not repeating myself. Soon a wind drifted upon me. That's what I did read that. So he is being spiritually, if you will, transported on the boat to the shore, to once again kind of hook up with the wedding party, if I'm remembering this monster.
Going to his homeland.
Oh, but
so this is before. You have two timelines at work.
Right.
Yeah, so the poem is the story the mariner's telling is in the past, but we're readers, we're in the present of being the wedding guest, hearing the story told. Yeah, okay. So the wedding guest,
so he's still reminiscing.
The mariners,
he's still reminiscing.
He's still telling his story.
Okay.
And so that moment I want to talk about musically for a minute, because it's one of my favorite moments in the piece. If you think about all of the dark penance at sea that this mariner's gone through, and then soon a breeze blew upon me, and the music lightens and it becomes very ephemeral, and that's the sound of home. That's the smell of home. He can smell, oh, I recognize I'm home. And you imagine the journey this mariner's been on, and you imagine the hell on earth he's been through, and this boat's moving forward, and the thing he would have longed for more than anything, to be home. And so at that moment, he recognizes that breeze, and the breeze came upon me. And then you hear he starts to see his home. And the narrator that's a moment where you would break down in tears.
And may I just say, thank you for reminding me of that moment, but it's there very clearly. And I think it has to do with my whole impression of what you've written. You have captured every single narrative mood, really to a level of perfection. And what I mean by that is not to make it sound all that crazy, but just that your audience, I think, is what I'm trying to get at. This piece is engineered for an audience, I think, quite deliberately, and it's engineered to present a great masterpiece to an audience that in a very accessible manner. The whole thing is brilliant. Yeah. Okay. So now where are we? He's now been. And what I meant about that is that as you were explaining it to me, and you're helping me kind of remember. I think, as I mentioned, maybe two, maybe three, maybe I heard it 3 times today. And it's hard, especially with a text that is so complex and so deep. But
Yeah.
that was, I'm just kind of trying to say, I, as a first time listener, and then as you reminded me of that moment, yes, I felt it. I felt some kind of wonderful relief, a kind of peace, as he has, in fact, been delivered to his home. And it was so clear you could practically smell it, as you mentioned. Okay,
That's great.
yeah.
Yeah.
How about this whole hermit scene in
So
part
yeah,
C?
the boat comes into the harbor, and it's being manned now by, basically it's arrived there on supernatural means, and it's just sitting in the mariners' homeland's harbor. And there's a hermit who lives by the shore and who serves and prays for mariners and says he loves to hear their stories. Basically, a monk. If you think a hermit's kind of a religious, um, isolated, solitary religious person, came out, and they realized there's a very strange boat out there. So let's row out. Let's go greet the visitor. There's a new boat. Let's go say hello. And the hermit comes with the pilot. There's someone who's rowing the boat, and the pilot's son is there, and they row out to sea. And as
But
they
it's a
come out
trap.
to sea,
Have I spoiled it? It's a trap.
it's not a it's not quite a trap, but it is. If they don't get there, the mariner can't get off the boat because he would have no way to dock the ship. He'd be stuck there. It's actually the hermit ends up being the means by which the mariner can eventually be conveyed to shore. Now you don't know that at the time, because the pilot comes up to the boat, and they're saying, "Wow, the boat didn't answer our cheer." Basically, we said, "Hi, boat," and nobody answered because everybody on the boat's dead except the mariner. And they approach the boat, and as they do, the boat will now be consumed by the ocean on the spot, and you hear the
Sinks like
torrential
lead.
whirlpool begin. It sinks
Sinks
like
like
lead.
lead.
And you hear in the poem, the description, the sound of it crushing into the ocean is so loud that it's reverberating on the cliff. There's this echo, and you hear that in the music. And the text describes it goes down with such a thunder fit. It goes down like a rock, like lead, and the whirlpool is swimming because it's sucked down into the water so fast. The mariner's adrift, and the hermit grabs the mariner, puts him in the boat, and the people in the boat are like, "What are you, a devil? What just happened?" And you still hear the echo of the ship sinking is still ringing off the hillside. It's a super powerful moment in the
And,
poem.
and by the way, Melville must have also read this poem. That's straight out of Moby Dick. At the very end where the kid surfaces and crawls
Mm-hmm.
onto the coffin and stuff like that. I mean,
Yeah.
so much rich material spun off of this poem. I'm realizing today, as I
Mm-hmm.
tried to navigate my way through, which I'm glad you said is a rather long poem,
It is. Yeah.
and the score. But it's just a thrilling piece of poetry, and also it's so clear to me that, well, it's also that kind of almost gothic romanticism of the time, right up into the 1840s and whatnot. You know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
The Brahmses, the Schumanns in music, and so on, and the great poets, and Byron, the whole thing. That's this macabre romanticism,
Mm-hmm.
gothic romanticism. Mm.
Yep.
Yeah.
It lends itself to an epic treatment. And that was back to your first question about why did I write it. I read a lot of poetry as a young man, just as a budding artist, wanting to enrich myself and experience the world. And I found this poem, and it was so epic in scale. It just felt so appropriate that it would have an orchestral treatment. As a classical composer, that would be, to me, the equivalent of the 12-foot wide canvas, oil painting canvas of the great
Yeah, you
masters.
got it.
Like,
Oh, exactly right. Yeah, no,
you
that's
gotta bring it big.
yeah,
If you have a poem with this kind of
yeah.
sensational imagery, it wants the massed forces of an orchestra.
Thank you. And I'm a conductor, and I know all about giant
Yeah.
tapestries of sound. I love all that. Well, that's exactly right. And just to the guests are seen. He prayeth well who livest best. The
Mm-hmm.
mariner leaves the wedding party. Nice bit of musical narrative, a calming moment in the story, and then this is where this is that whole thing. In other words, through all of this horror and even the imagery on the CD, it's a ship in horrendous distress, let alone a ship of dead people, and all the other
Mm-hmm.
subtleties of the whole thing. Nevertheless, as you said, it's penance and redemption, if you will. That
It
last
is.
peaceful moment, and of course he deserves it.
Hmm.
It's been to hell and back after all. But that reminds me of
Yeah.
the Maelstrom, the Poe novel, where
Hmm.
the ship is being sucked down into the Maelstrom, and I can't remember quite how it ends now. It's been years, but that whole imagery of whirlpools and boats, and also the age was the age of sail. I mean, everybody knew this thing called sailing upon the seas in ships, if you will, even if they never went to sea themselves. It's just something we can't even hardly imagine.
We can, and think about what the dark mystery of the ocean would be before we had all the cameras and the scuba diving equipment and all the knowledge we have of what's under the water is an artifact of maybe the last 100 years.
Yeah,
Mostly people saw it as a place of incredible danger. Obviously there was whaling and there's other fisheries, and it was a place where you could gain a living, you could have adventure, but incredibly dangerous and alien world. And
yeah,
the
and
oceans are most of the globe.
yeah, and sea travel was very, very dangerous. And I've
Very
mentioned to
dangerous.
you, I think, off camera, the sinking of the Grosvenor off the coast of South Africa in something 1735 or something became all the news, especially
Hmm.
in the homeland because it was coming home from India. But just that idea, and I'm a ship nut, I'll confess
Hmm.
now. And so, what intrigues me is how fragile ship travel by ship was until maybe even as late as, well, 1907 or something, Lusitania or the Celtic or some of those metal
Hmm.
multi-funneled ships, because the ships from previously help. I'm going to sound like an idiot. The navigator, the guy at the wheel
Hmm.
stayed outside all the time in all weather. There was nothing about even a wheelhouse, a contained
Right.
area in the 1870s and so on. So yeah, it just all reinforces a couple of things. It reinforces how important it is for us. Pardon me, I've got the sloppy lips here. To read the masterpieces, and I think I've already confessed 2 or 3 times that, of course, I know about this poem all my life since high school. At least I've known about this poem, never read it until this morning. That's it.
It's one of those, and Dan, you've hit on something that I would hope to bequest as a gift to people who spend their time with this music. Um, I love the poem because it's worthy, and I hope my music is both entertaining, but there is an educational mission that I hope it opens up this poem to people to give them a new appreciation for my own work, of course, but also to value this work as it should be valued. It is an important milestone in our language as English speakers. It's worthy of people's time and attention, and it will reward some study and contemplation. It's worth it.
And that's why I'm so pleased, as we've said probably ad nauseum, by the way you have put this together. It is ready to go. It's begging for an audience. As we've mentioned even earlier, I'll add some, even, I hope I'm not offending you, but the idea of some imagery, some sophisticated video imaging and whatnot. And you've got a huge, major piece of success for any public. You know what I mean? That's how accessible a piece is in the very best possible sense.
Thank you.
Well, what a treat it's been. I think we better shut her down. Gustav Hoyer, 2024 Novona recordings release, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner for orchestra and narrator, and there's a version for orchestra alone. Composition date is about 2006. The artists are the Budapest Film Orchestra. I did not mention the conductor. I'm sorry, I didn't write that down. But with the narrator, Kent Stevens, just a
Mhm.
fabulous, wonderful job. I'll put all this up. I think, have we covered everything? Do you have anything that I've been too confused to discuss?
No, I appreciate that. The only thing I would add is, as far as uh, performance of the work, it is for orchestra and narrator. I actually was I was in a collaboration that didn't fruit, but I thought it could be really fascinating to do it with a dance troupe. Actually, have the dancers
I've been thinking the
dance
same thing all day, except it's complicated because there
with
is
the
so much
narrator.
story. There is so much
There is.
convoluted story going on there. But
Mhm.
yeah, in other words, there are just enormous possibilities. But I think probably the easiest in terms of really going there is some kind of additional videography of some sort.
Sure.
And
Yeah,
that has become,
absolutely.
when I was younger, I used to just go, eh. to that whole idea. The music is sacred and we must not, and therefore we must wear white tie. You know, the whole thing, all my life, I'm completely over it because of the sophistication of the messaging these days. And anything that will enhance an experience for an audience, in my mind, is good. And this piece is beautiful all by itself as a piece for narrator and orchestra. And as I said, it's just beautiful. The poem runs by very quickly, and it's a thriller of a poem. Okay, Gustav Hoyer, many, many thanks. Great fun talking.
Likewise. It was a pleasure.
We'll see you in a bit when I get the page up and stuff like that.
That's great. Thank you so much for taking time with me. I appreciate it.